Hi class. So the first lecture for our class is really an overview in a term called information architecture. Um, this subject really applies to lots of different forms of design, but specifically we're going to explore it from the perspective of communications design. But first, let's talk a little bit about where this term came from. A guy named Richard Saul Wurman was an American architect and graphic designer. And he coined this phrase, information architecture, and is sort of considered to be a pioneer in this concept. So, information architecture is really the notion of organizing and labeling information. Information comes in many forms in today's society. We have websites, software, books, magazines, newspapers, and all other forms of visual and written communication can sort of fall into this category. So the idea is that information is not just transmitted; it's presented, it's structured, it's designed. And when we talk about information architecture, what I'm really talking about is what I call design with a capital D, right? So design with a lowercase d is aesthetics, making things look pretty, color, type, etc. But design with a capital D is really looking at the whole experience, the whole media consumption experience. And so we're going to talk in this lecture a little bit how that applies specifically to print publications. And as the semester wears on, obviously, we'll look at design from a number of different perspectives, from digital design and storytelling to print and other forms of storytelling in that general communications design sphere. But today the examples that we look at are mostly going to be print examples because really the term information architecture grew largely out of news design and print design strategies. So from that perspective, one really important thing to consider is that today's audiences have more sources of news and information than ever before. We are bombarded with, information that comes to us in many forms, from print media to digital media, websites, across multiple devices, mobile devices like tablets and smartphones, and through other emerging mechanisms like social media. It was funny, last semester I asked my journalism students, where do you get your news and information? And several of them said Facebook. And I thought, for a moment, I kind of cringed. And then I realized what they're really talking about is this notion of an aggregate of content that gets filtered to us through social media. So if I see an interesting story, I might post it to my Facebook page. And if you're my Facebook friend, you might see that and then click on that story and go read it. You're not really getting your news and information from Facebook. You're getting it from whoever published the story. For example, it might be a New York Times article or a Boston Globe article. But we have that perception that we're actually getting the news and information through social media. So we have to really, explore all of the different mechanisms through which people receive news and information and understand that variety affects how they consume. So today's readers are in a hurry. They have a variety of sources and they're very influenced by them. So they want you to send them off smartly to other sources. They don't necessarily read the way they used to. My dad is in his 70s. He reads several newspapers from cover to cover every day. He reads every story, every headline, every word in those newspapers. But he grew up reading newspapers, and that's been part of his daily routine for many, many years. Today's readers sort of pick and choose and read the stories they're most interested, skip with others. And so we have to think about that scanning and sampling practice and how that affects their consumption habits, and then also how that affects our presentation strategies. So there are three general categories that today's readers fall into. The first one is my dad, the reader, someone who reads newspapers and other types of publications from cover to cover every day, regardless of level of interest. That group of people is dwindling and fast. And in fact, we're not really worried about them because my dad will read the story regardless of how it's designed. He's not really as influenced by design with a capital D or design with a lowercase d. But it's the scanner and the sampler, the people who sample stories that he or she are interested in and then move around sort of plucking what's most interesting, or the scanner, people who scan publications for headlines and photos and main visual entry points and really only engage with that content. So because readers can be sort of classified into these three groups, we see that in print, particularly the last 15 years or so, there have been a few design trends that are important for you to note. Better navigation, more information layering. We're going to talk about what that is in a minute. Less emphasis on traditional writing, although good writing is still important. It's harder for us to pull people into stories than it used to be. So design becomes an increasingly important tool to pull people in, attract their attention, and get them to stick with a publication. And then, of course, because of digital media and the web, you're starting to see more of a conversation between the print publication and online publications. Our goal is to really think about the ways in which we can better serve the scanning reader. So one way to do that is through this WED philosophy. WED was developed by Mario Garcia. If you've never heard that name before, you should Google it. Mario is sort of one of the fathers of news design, news and information design. And he is a media design consultant now and works all over the world redesigning newspapers, websites, mobile devices, news publications for mobile devices. So Mario is an incredible leader in the field of information architecture. And the WED concept is the notion that no one element, not writing, not editing, not design, not even photography, is more important than the other. And in fact, good information architecture comes when we put writing, editing, and design on equal footing. And we understand that design is a part of the storytelling process. It's not just making things look pretty. So, somebody who practices this WED concept, analyzes information and determines the best way to transfer and present it, really looks at a story and tries to figure out, how can I design this package so that the most important information rises to the top, so that the scanner and sampler see that important information quickly. We determine how each portion of the story is best told. So we think about what part of the story is best told through photos, what part is best through graphics, and then what part is best through, the written components. So we take a very visual approach to design and writing. We take an approach that really puts design and content on equal footing and allows content to drive design overall. So I'm going to show you lots of examples, and I'd like you to really take a look at all of these pages, and I'll try to let the PowerPoint linger on some of these examples so that you can take a peek at them. But of course, you can come back and look at these, pause if you want to later. But this is a page from the Staten Island Advance. This is actually a prototype from the redesign, which was done several years ago by Garcia Media. And for this project, the Staten Island Advance really wanted to increase the visual devices on the page, the display type, the photographs, color, and other quick reads, so that even somebody who's just scanning the page, even somebody who's not going to read the 5 actual stories on the page, will still come away with a lot of information. So to test this prototype and see how well it achieves that goal, let's take the text for the stories off of the page. And I think you can very quickly see that even if you're somebody who's just scanning headlines and display type and captions, there's actually quite a bit of information on this page. And if you're a good Wedditor, then you think about the words that appear in that display type, and you find ways to really entice people to read the story. So the headline, "Her walk to the drugstore turns fatal." That's a compelling headline, right? So we want to, instead of, woman dies in crash, right, which is a little bit more bland, both are accurate. Her walk to the drugstore turns fatal is much more engaging and perhaps pulls people in a little bit more. So it's not just about creating a design that has lots of scanning elements, but it's also then thinking about what those scanning elements do to pull the reader into the story so that we get people back here. We get them reading those stories and engaged with the content. So we can see the reverse of this. We can see bad design and what happens to a page when we have no scanning elements. This is a page from Catalyst magazine that is pre-redesign. So this is before the redesign. And you can see that if we do the same thing to this page, we take off all the text, my goodness, we have a lot of dead space. And we have a really poorly written headline. And we have, some pretty boring subheads, spread thin, deploying staff, poor job descriptions. That don't really give us much insight into what this story is about. I mean, of course, with little guidance, students drift through and out of school. That's what I call a no-duh headline. In other words, that headline tells me absolutely nothing that I don't already know. Of course, if the students don't have guidance, they're going to slip through the cracks, right? So in fact, a better headline would give me more meat, something to really dive into, something that really gives me a sense of how this particular story is going to add to the conversation about students slipping through the cracks more than other stories. And again, right now, the scanning elements don't do that. So if I'm a scanner and I read that headline, I'm going to think to myself, well, no duh, this story isn't providing any new information, and I'm probably going to turn the page as opposed to dive into all of that gray text on the page. So these are the problems that we're trying to solve. So how can we serve the scanning reader? Well, again, we need to be information architects, not just designers. We're going to talk a lot about basic design principles in the next few weeks, color and type and all of those things. But really, it starts with content. So you can pick pretty colors and you can pick pretty typefaces and you can create a nice clean grid structure. But if you don't start with the content, then you're really not advancing storytelling. So that's why this first lecture is really about content and the organization of information and how we use visual signals to create texture and to create story packages that contain lots of elements to entice people on many different layers or levels. So this brings to us another term. So we have information architecture, we have the WED concept, and now we have information layering. So this is the notion that instead of just taking a really long story and slapping it on the page with a boring headline, let's think about the story and how we can pull out the elements of that story that help the reader understand at a glance why this story is important to them. So information layering is the process of planning and presenting stories in traditional and non-traditional structures by condensing information and presenting it on different visual levels. The result is an organized, navigable page or package that is reader-friendly and comprehension-driven. So that's a mouthful, but we're going to look at a bunch of examples to see how this happens in practice. The first step is to think about all of the different information schemes that are available to you. So in addition to headlines, we have other typographic devices that allow us to pull out important information. Labels, kickers, summary decks, initial caps, lead-ins, and subheads. Display type should be engaging. Don't state the obvious. Use those elements, those labels, those headlines, those deck heads, and secondary display type to really capture someone's interest. So here is a page from a Hispanic Business magazine, and this is, again, pre-redesign. And I always use this example. I love this example because I think there are several things going on here that kind of make it a flop. The first is that really this photograph is a mugshot. There is no reason for this picture to run bigger than a thumbprint. The reason it's running so large, as you can probably guess, is because there is no other art. And somebody told this designer, you have to have art on the page. You can't just have a big gray block of text with no images. And so they took a picture of this woman and used it larger than it needed to be because they didn't really have any other options. There's another problem with this presentation. Let's read the headline. Mexican Industries goes under. So this company is going out of business. It's falling apart. And the picture is a woman who is the CEO and chairman of Mexican Industries. And she's just smiling from ear to ear. So here you have also a huge disconnect between the headline, which is telling you that this business is going under and this woman's about to be out of a job, and then her picture, which is her smiling. Well, of course she's smiling because they're taking a portrait of her. She's not going to frown. That would be even weirder, right? But The point here is that the visual image and the message, and actually what the story is about, don't match. So immediately we're creating conflict for the reader. We're creating tension for the reader. We're not really helping the reader understand this story. And then, of course, we have the jump page. Still needed art, right? Nobody wanted to have a big, long page with no art. And so what did they do? They did the worst design sin ever. They pulled quotes to fill space. And they're not even good quotes. I feel really sad. There are people who have been with Mexican Industries for 14 or more years, and now they have to start over again. This is a no-duh quote, right? These are not compelling quotes that are really moving. These quotes are stating the obvious. And so once again, there's nothing really here that's going to entice that scanning reader. So what we did in this redesign is we said, how about instead of photos that don't really match the content, how about we build a library of glance boxes, is what we call these, at-a-glance boxes. And we have a really nice design, we make use of color, and we integrate information that would actually serve the scanning and sampling readers. So instead of a big picture of her smiling that doesn't really match the page, how about we do a fact box that gives a couple of mugshots of the key players, and then a timeline of missed opportunities, and then a what comes next. So in other words, in this one quick read box, I can very quickly come to an understanding of what this story is about, why it matters to me, what went wrong, and what are the next steps. So this is a Hispanic Business Magazine after the redesign. And again, this is a different page, but what you see here is a couple of things. From an aesthetic point of view, we added some white space. We had added a nice typographic palette. Notice up in the upper right-hand corner, we have a typographic element there that's a fact. We have a deck head, we have a main head, and then we have this at-a-glance box that has bold lead-ins, good use of color, nice labels, and right away it serves the scanning and sampling reader and gives them something to bite into. It's very easy to access and very digestible. So you can take this idea of information layering to, as extreme as you want. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2001, 3? I don't remember now the date. I'm sorry. But when we did, the Daily News took this approach with the front page. So rather than run stories on the front page, they actually created a broadsheet newspaper page that has a lot of information layering. So you can see we have the label, Attack on Iraq, Troops Move In, 3 headlines that give you 3 different pieces of information and varying weights of typography for some texture. We have teasers to stories inside on the right-hand side, but underneath each there's a 1 or 2 sentence blurb that gives you a sense of what each story is about. On the left-hand side we have a map, below that a timeline, and at the bottom of the page reaction from world leaders. So here you see you have lots of different information schemes, both visual, like the map and the pictures, and typographic, like the labels, the summary decks, the initial caps, bold lead-ins, and subheads, as well as some alternative story structures to help pull people in. This whole page, in fact, serves the scanning reader. So in this case, if you're a scanning reader, chances are you'll probably read the whole page. And then if you want to if you're a sampling reader, you'll probably dive inside and read those stories that piqued your interest. So here we're hoping to create a more active, interactive reading experience for audiences. So what you have to think about when you're creating a layered package is what are the alternative story forms that are available beyond the traditional story that allow us to create some elements that help serve the scanning reader. And we know that the more visual the presentation, the more packaged the presentation, the easier it will be for our audience to consume, access, and digest. So here we have a before and after of the packaging of a story. The page on the left, well, the story is about, it's from a Catholic magazine, and it's actually about the role of religion in presidential campaign. And you see on the left-hand page, they actually did try to do a little information layering. They have this little fact box at the bottom of the page, and I know it's a little bit hard to read on your computer screen, but what that fact box does is it lists all of the different campaign platform topics that are of importance to Catholics. right? And it has check marks next to the ones that are covered. And at the bottom, religion has a question mark next to it. So even though this is a glance box, a fact box, what are the facts, right? There's no real information there. It's really a typographic illustration. So when we redesigned this page, we focused on giving a little bit more context and depth. So if you look at the picture underneath, you see hot topics below. And what we've done is we've listed all or some of those topics that were in the little fact box on the left, but this time we gave more information with each, right? We gave more information about what various candidates are saying about those different campaign platform topics. And we also included some mugshots of each of the presidential candidates, and we included some information about where each of them stand on a couple of the different issues. So this allows us to give a lot more context to help the reader really understand what's going on. So we need to review the story first, look for graphics potential and layering opportunities, and then ask, how is the story best told? So being a good designer means you have to read the story and you have to get a sense of what the story is about so that you can create a page like this. So you see again here, there's the same amount of text, and in fact, the text that's used in that hot topics box was pulled directly from the story. So not only have we repackaged the story, but we've actually re-edited the story so that we can highlight the elements within the story that are most important, that we really want to highlight and have stand out. Here's another page from Hispanic Business Magazine, a travel page, and here it is post redesign. So again, you see lots of typographic devices, lots of information layering, and the use of color here pulls you around the page and creates an entry point. This is a page from Professional Builder magazine. Oh my God, a whole magazine for professional builders. You can imagine how boring some of those stories are. And also, this magazine struggles because there aren't many opportunities for photographs. You've got pictures of builders like this one, and then you've probably got a lot of potential pictures of half finished buildings. But from issue to issue, if you're trying to put out this magazine month after month after month, there really aren't that many options for visuals. So when we did Professional Builder magazine, we took some cues from Real Simple magazine. If you've ever seen Real Simple magazine, you know it's incredibly well packaged, and it really takes this notion of information layering to an extreme. In fact, Real Simple magazine was created and art directed with the notion that we want the stories themselves to be real simple. Get in, get out. And so information layering really drives this publication. So in fact, every story in Real Simple magazine, like this one, is more of an information graphic. In fact, there are no long form stories. Usually a story in Real Simple takes this kind of approach. And so really the reporter is the information architect and is really coming up with a very visually driven and graphic approach to storytelling. Here we have a page on summer stain removal, right? So instead of a traditional story with a beginning, middle, and end in an inverted pyramid style, they just sort of pulled out the most important points and created this really nice visual comparative package. I love this one. This one is about how to purchase the perfect towel, which seems kind of frivolous, but remember this magazine is actually targeted toward, you know, young working moms, right? So lots of stories in there that are, you know, how to manage your household, real simple. So what they did was they created this sort of, you know, very visual, very layered approach. And you see the story's a little bit longer. But as we jump to the next page, you see, again, a little visual sort of what I call a charticle. It's actually kind of a chart and an article at the same time comparing these different towels. Very, very simple design approach. Even someone with very little design skills could create this page pretty simply. And so really, you know, one great message that Real Simple gives us is that good design can often be quite simple. It doesn't need to be overdone and elaborate. This is after the redesign several years ago. If you remember, the East Coast had a major power outage, and Staten Island was one of the cities affected by that. And they, for their front page that day, they really wanted to show what was happening all over the city as a result of the power outage. So instead of running a standard story, they took this really awesome approach with a black background. And notice what they did was they wrote miniature stories. So here's the full page, and then as we zoom in, you can see 5 miniature stories with little images that sort of reflect what that part of the story is about. And then there's teasers to where you can read more on those topics. So really you've got a nice approach here that really does serve the scanning reader. Again, you see short story at the top, miniature stories down below, and another page that if you're a scanner or a sampler, you're probably going to read every word. So a great concept here when you're thinking about packaging information. Here's a page from that redesign. This is pre-redesign. You can see it's all about the summer concert series. The design itself is not great. I mean, bad use of color and compositionally not great. But what we really tried to do in this redesign was make it more accessible, right? And organize the information in a way that highlights concerts more individually. So the story under All Star Summer actually has all of these bands listed: Cher and Eminem and Bonnie Raitt and Ozzy Osbourne. Those are all listed, but it's written in story form as opposed to, chunky little blurbs that the scanning and sampling reader can get into quickly. So you see here, not only is the aesthetic better typography, better use of color, better organization, but the actual layout is structured in a way that supports storytelling and allows that sampling and scanning reader to really get in and get out. Here we're back to the Catholic publication. This is a story that they did for Father's Day. It's all about how to be a good Catholic father, how to raise your children effectively in the Catholic faith. And again, what you see here, they have a fact box. They were trying, but the story itself is sort of structured in a very linear beginning, middle, and end way. So what we did with the redesign was we tried to pull out the chunks to say, hey, you don't really have to read this story from beginning to end the way you would a traditional story. You can kind of jump in wherever you want. So if you're somebody who has trouble with patience, maybe you jump right into the section on patience and skip everything else. So this kind of structure is much more effective than this one at really highlighting what's most important and giving the reader the opportunity to navigate the story the way they want to. This is one of my favorite examples of information layering, so I want you to pay close attention here to how this evolved. This is the San Francisco Examiner pre-redesign. And you see this centerpiece. First of all, you see that it's one of those old gray ladies, right? Like very, very, very heavy on text, very gray, not very visually enticing, not very inviting. So this page is incredibly daunting to the scanning and the sampling reader because we just see lots of text, not a lot of images, and the images that are there aren't very good. This centerpiece story, Kids in the Mission Grow Up on Violence. Here's the thing. The Mission is a neighborhood in San Francisco. And if you know the Mission, you know it's violent. You know it's a dangerous neighborhood. So this headline is not telling the people of San Francisco anything they don't already know. However, you're going to find out in a moment the story is actually incredibly interesting. So we redesigned the San Francisco Examiner to turn it into a tabloid. So this changes the dynamic quite a bit. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of this, but I want you to see that this is actually an early prototype of the Examiner, changing it from a broadsheet to a tabloid. And you see that it gets even worse, actually, as the paper shrinks because we have less room to really play that story big. And now you just have a really big image that doesn't tell us anything at all. And then, again, the headline, Kids, the Mission, and Violence, not really telling me something I don't already know. So what do we do to better package the story? What did we say before? Step 1, get into the story and let's read the story and let's find out why this story is even being written in the first place. So here's the kicker. There are several paragraphs in this story that are shocking. 34% of children growing up in the Mission have access to guns. 47% know someone who died from violence, and 50% were victims of violence. And then you go over to the right-hand side and you see this incredibly moving quote. In a lot of cases, kids can get guns more easily than school supplies. Oh my gosh. So right here, this is why you should care, right? It's the statistics that make this story important, right? So how can we redesign that package so that it goes from being a boring page that doesn't really tell me why I should care to a page that really highlights these important layers of information? So here's what we did. We said, you know what, that photo is really not that good, so let's crop it and run it small. And then let's look at those statistics and find a way to bring them to the front, make them the dominant visual element. So here the statistics are front and center, and now you have a reason to actually read the story. Virginian Pilot is really great at this. They do it every day. They have these centerpiece packages like this one that have very provocative, engaging headlines and that give the scanning and sampling reader a real entry point. This is called a billboard. Isn't that cool? They call this approach the billboard. And they create sort of a billboard-like design on the page to really grab people's attention. Very cool for the front page of a newspaper. So to wrap up, we'll end with this another great San Francisco Examiner page where you see statistics and numbers really taking front and center and becoming the dominant element. To be good at information layering, to be a good Wedditor, we have to ask what is really new or relevant about this story, and most important, why should the reader care? And then, only once we know the answers to those questions can we begin design. Because now we need to make sure that these points are reflected in the surface elements, the display type, the images, the graphics, the packaging of the story. This is information architecture. You can look at this page from the Examiner and you can see how it's not just design, it's not just layout, it's not just using colors and type to make things look pretty. It's actually using design as a storytelling method, as a mechanism for pulling people in, and as a way to architect the information, to package and structure that information so that you can capture as many readers as possible. Thanks, guys. Have a good week.